Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to today's Hope reading. Man, I love this story so much. Once again, we'll see if we can reasonably get through two chapters, and if not, we may start in midpoint, but I think we might be able to. As you've seen as we've gone, some of these chapters are quite a bit longer than others, and that's the way it is. The Bible's like that too, so I am unapologetic. Okay, so Chapter 21 Flight from Darkness. Alva saw Hope's face fall when he uttered the words, "We have to run." "I can carry you, Hope," he said gently. For the first time in many days, her face glowed faintly. "No," Hope said bravely. "I can run, for a while anyway." All took a final drop from the pool and ran to the entrance of the lake trail. Now they were all very glad that Alva had encouraged them to fill their water vessels immediately. It would take the soldiers between 3 and 4 hours to come up the trail. In that time, they could put a great deal of distance between them. The entrance did not lead directly into the dry lake, but rather into a small canyon that led downward into it. Hundreds of season changes before, the rain from frequent storms had flown down this canyon into the lake. It was full of water then. In those days, it was called the Poison Lake because the water flowed in, but there was no outlet, so it was stagnant and rank. On the eastern end of the lake was a high wall of earth and rocks. In the heavy rain, the level of the lake would rise, but never to the edge of the wall. Finally, there were heavier rains than usual for several season changes in a row. Gradually, the level of the lake rose toward the top of the eastern wall. Eventually, it overflowed and water began to spill over the lowest point. The heavy rains continued, and the water pouring over the wall finally caused the wall to begin to give way at that spot. Then the water began to rush through more forcefully, cutting a groove in the wall. And the force of the water was so great that it cut a groove all the way down to the bottom of the wall. All the water in the Poison Lake rushed into the forest below, cutting a ravine in the hill. This created what seemed like a doorway out of the lake and a natural path leading into the forest. From then on, the rain would still flow down the canyon into the lake. The western side of the lake was slanted, and the canyon ran right into it. But on the other 3 sides, there were high walls that were almost vertical, and the bottom of the lake was mostly flat. Thus, in the heavy rains, the water would flow through the eastern groove rather than filling the lake, leaving only a few pools on the lower parts of the lake bed that would soon dry up. Thus, the former lake was waterless and was renamed the Dry Lake. Though they were all terribly discouraged at having to run when they thought they would be able to rest for the first time in days, their fear of the Dark Warrior gave them new energy. They ran as fast as they could. When they felt they could run no more, they stopped for a short rest and drink before continuing. Luckily, the water coming from their pool continued to flow along the side of the canyon in a small stream, collecting in occasional pools along the way. When they got up to run again, Hope staggered. She was trying valiantly, but she could not run anymore. Alva gently picked her up and carried her as they ran on. She glowed warmly in his arms, and rather than slowing him down, he found that she gave him fresh energy. It was difficult for the others to keep up with him. Eventually they came down into the lake bed and immediately began to run across toward the eastern opening. The lake was large, so it still took some time to get across. The stream collected in a small pool near the opening before running out down the ravine. Here they stopped for a rest and drink before going on. When Alva put Hope down, he addressed the group. "This is a good place for us to hold the soldiers. Hillel, you and Nera take Hope on to safety." This came as a shock to everyone.
Wait a minute, said Philor. We are several hours ahead of them. We can lose them in the forest, and if they ever do find us, we can make a last stand then.
This seemed reasonable to the rest of the company. Hillel saw value in Alva's plan, but he did not speak. It seemed too much to ask the warriors to face certain death. There is a great chance in that, Alva replied. We can hold them longer here because we have a natural place to hold them at this opening in the wall. But we can't stand against that dark warrior, Keel said. You said yourself that even hundreds of men couldn't fight him. The entire reason we came this way was to avoid fighting him at all costs. I also said, Alva replied, if we do have to clash with that army at any point, I'd rather they be behind us rather than in the front. I said that because I knew Hope would be able to run on ahead that way. Now Hillel has to go with her because he knows how to find Lasse Creston, and she should have at least one warrior with her at the end. Nira goes with her because Nira is not meant to leave her side. 8 men can stand side by side in this opening and hold these men, and Chad and Shinar can shoot arrows from behind the rest of us until they replace the first men who fall. Whether we can hold them for long with that dark warrior leading them is something that I don't know, but it's worth the chance to buy Hope a little more time to get to safety. We won't last a minute, Keel persisted. They're miles behind us and we already feel terrified. We'll run the moment we see him. Better to keep running now and stay farther ahead.
I hate to admit it, said Pryor, but I think Keel is right. We'll flee before him right away. I feel it already, and I've never been afraid of anyone before. Better we all stay together and help Hope on as fast as we can.
You men do what you will, Alva replied. I'm staying here on the chance that I can slow them down. But why throw your life away when you have no real chance of success? Chad asked. You're the smartest warrior that I've ever met. We all know you can face danger, but you always know the best ways to avoid it, too. Because, Alva said, for the first time in my life, I have not taken my father's advice. He said, give your sword to a job if the pay is good, but never give your heart. Alva paused and looked at Hope directly in her deep blue eyes. But my heart is given. When he said this, Hope shined like never before. This was no normal lovesick glow. She shined so brightly, she lighted up the space around her. Her light was visible even though the sun was shining brightly, and the whole company could feel the warmth of her glow. He said his heart was given. Alva loved her. Alva loved her. She radiated when she heard what he said. So I'm staying, Alva continued. And Pensor is staying with me because he is in my service by his own voluntary oath. They all looked shocked again, but Pensor nodded. We'll hold them as long as we can. The rest of you feel free to go on. I understand, and I do not think any less of you for it, my friends. Though time was short, there was a moment of silent thought. At last, Bonson spoke. I'll stand with you, Alva Dene. There are worse things in life to face than terror and death, like living. Thank you, my lord, Alva replied with a new respect for this young man. I'm staying too, I guess, said Pryor. I couldn't live with running while the 3 of you stayed. After all we've been through together, I can't imagine a more honorable death than falling alongside Lord Alva Dene. Soon all the warriors agreed to stay. The example of these men and the warmth of Hope's glow had given them new courage. Before Hillel took Hope and Nera on, he spoke to Alva. Danae means shield in Old Lacinian, but Alva Danae carries no shield. Take mine, you will need it for this kind of fight. Alva received it gratefully. He chuckled to himself at the irony of the son of Al-Salah Danae making his last stand with a Hurin shield. Nera took Hope by the hand. Hope was in such a state of happiness that she was not drinking in the full ramifications of what was happening. Alva loved her. Her fears were stilled. Her dreams had come true. This was such a revelation that Alva's imminent death had not yet dawned on her. Goodbye, Hope, Alva said as he stared into her blue eyes again. Goodbye, Alva, she replied. I'll see you soon. She blushed and glowed and then very shyly finished with, I love you. I love you, Alva said with a smile. Now be off! Hillel, Nera, and Hope ran through the pass and continued on their way. For some reason, Hope was still not grasping that Alva was staying to face his own death. Perhaps it was because she had never seen him fail to overcome great danger. Perhaps the revelation of his love was such wonderful news that nothing could dampen it for some time. Maybe it was because she was exhausted almost into a delirium. As they ran on, her mind was lost in visions of little boys who looked like Alva running around and fighting each other with wooden swords and making silly jokes. She had never felt so happy. Chapter 22. The Stand. The upside to the decision the 10 warriors had made was that they had several hours to rest before the enemy would reach them. This also gave Alva plenty of time to instruct them on what to do. Though he had never been in a war, he had read all of his ancestors' books on warfare and had been in enough fights to understand them practically. While the enemies were still some distance away, Chad and Shinar could begin to take them early with their longbows. When they got close enough to send their own volleys of arrows, the warriors would fall to the back of the gateway and stand behind the wall so no arrows could hit them. When the soldiers came close enough that any enemy arrows would run the danger of killing their own men, they would stand side by side in the doorway. The opposing army would not be able to surround them, but would be funneled into the doorway and have to face them on a man-to-man basis. With this plan, they could hold them for a long time. The only contingency was the Dark Warrior and the fear he wielded. For most of the way, however, they still felt the warmth of Hope's light, so they did not tremble in fear until the enemy was nearly in sight. When they began to feel the fear again, Alva addressed his companions. Now remember, we don't know if this Dark Warrior wields any weapon but fear. It may be that we can master our fear and kill him. As soon as the soldiers were in sight, Chad and Shinar began to shoot at those in the front. They took out a few, but at that distance it was difficult because they were moving targets and were well armored. The Dark Warrior led his soldiers from behind. Soon he was visible on the other side of the lake behind his men. When Alva saw him, though he did not tell the men, he knew in his heart that this man's dark power was not limited to fear. They might hold the soldiers for a while, but they were all going to die. He, Alva Danae, was going to die. He was going to die here in the dry lake, slowing this dark company down and giving Hope a greater chance of escape. He had expected this when he made the decision to stay, but at this moment the realization sunk in. Miles away, the other 3 members of the party were still running. Hillel was now carrying Hope, but she was still glowing with joy. The moment Alva saw the Dark Warrior, Hope was shaken out of her euphoria. At that moment, she also finally understood that Alva Danae was going to die. Alva let Chad and Shinar do all the bow shooting because there was plenty of time to use all the arrows they had before the men got close enough to engage. They had hoped to get many more than they did, but when the Dark Warrior came in sight, all began to tremble. Their hands shook so badly that these expert bowmen could not shoot straight. With shaking hands, armor, and moving targets, they had brought down only 8 men by the time the arrows were spent. The soldiers spent a few volleys of their own, but the company was able to keep enough wit to move outside of view as they came. The enemy soon realized that this was pointless. This game would be played with swords and axes. As the soldiers approached, Alva and the company lined up side by side inside the doorway carved by the water so many season changes before. The doorway took about 10 steps to pass through, so the enemy soldiers would have to come straight at them. Alva stood in the center with Pensor on his right. To his left were Prior, Tombus, and Philor. To Pensor's right were Bonson, Jagrok, and Keel. Chad and Shinar stood behind, swords drawn, waiting to fill the gaps when the first men fell. As the enemy began to draw close, the company became more and more terrified. These soldiers were not terrifying. Without the Dark Warrior, Alva and the others would have stood a fighting chance. But they felt his presence. They felt freezing cold, and the things in life that had frightened them most began to fill their minds. Before the soldiers charged, Alva gave his friends one last word. Whatever happens, we stand. We fight for hope and the hope of all men. We stand until we fall. The 92 remaining soldiers in the Dark Warrior's command were certain of victory, but they were slightly uncomfortable. Entire armies typically fled before the power of the Dachmanim. Even though they were well trained, they seldom had difficult fighting to do because the terror of their leader. Most of their killing up to now had consisted of slashing fleeing enemies from behind or stabbing men as they cringed on the floor in terror. This looked to be a little more difficult, even though they outnumbered the enemy almost 10-1. When the Dark Company drew close, their leader gave them the command to charge. He believed that the force of their charge would push the prey backward out of the doorway where his men would slaughter them. Scared as they were, Alva's company stood their ground. The first line of charge was cloven in front of them. The soldiers continued to push in under the Dark Command, but they continued to be cut down as soon as they reached the warriors. Once the fighting began, the warriors were distracted somewhat from their terror. They were in their element, and they began to feel the energy that comes with a last stand for death and glory. Alva knew how to use a shield as well as he knew how to use every other weapon. He guarded himself well while slashing soldier after soldier with his sword. He was even able to provide a little protection for Prior on his left, who had no shield. Prior's mighty battle axe cut many a man asunder. Pensor fought as well as he had fought in the Camden Pass over 40 season changes before. Bonson had met and defeated most of the best swordsmen in Laconia and Huron in tournaments. The company's first skirmish had given him experience in real combat, and now he swept away enemies like a mighty hurricane. Tombus was anything but passive. His axe moved like lightning, cleaving all who approached. Jagrok, usually so calm, had personal reasons for hating the Dachmonians. His sword and mace destroyed many enemies. Keel and Philor did their job effectively on the edges. Outnumbered and tired as the warriors were, There would have been little competition if they had been clad for warfare rather than travel. As it was, the enemy was well armored and they had no armor. The enemy was also driven on by their dark master from behind, while Alva's company felt his terror from in front. The battle raged, and eventually the warriors began to grow tired. They had had no sleep and little rest for days, and skillful though they were, they had all received several wounds soon enough. Even Alva was wounded this time. This gave the fight more competition, and the soldiers of the Dark Company lasted longer and longer before they were brought down. Philor was the first to fall back. He received a spear in the shoulder, but as he fell back, Chad took his position, holding his sword with both hands and slashing fiercely. He had no shield, but he was fresh and very fast. Soon after Philor fell, Jagrok received a slash on his head. He moved back fast enough to prevent fatal damage, but was wounded in his lower abdomen by a sword from another soldier. He would have been cut to pieces, but Bonson widened the range of his fight and pushed back against Jagrok with his right shoulder, sending him falling backward, and immediately Shinar came in beside Bonson and the battle raged on. Dark soldiers would push in to join the fight, only to fall. Shinar and Tombus fell next, but severely wounded and bleeding, or both severely wounded and bleeding, but this gave the warriors a new fury. Though now only 6 stood against the enemy, they began to fight with a vengeance, even pushing the soldiers back. Alva had to check them before they chased them out into the lake and exposed themselves dangerously. Suddenly the Dark Warrior shouted, "Enough!" Somehow his voice sounded deep and shrill at the same time. After he said this, his soldiers backed away. He had only 20 left. 8 had been killed by arrows, and 72 had been cut down by the stand of Alva's company. The warrior knew that he might need those who were left to capture Hope. He had to finish this battle himself. The soldiers pulled away to the left and right in shame and backed up behind their Dachmanim leader. He alone now faced the 6 warriors who were still standing. A Dachmanim would avoid unveiling his full power if possible and remain content with causing terror and letting the soldiers do the legwork. He had needed to withhold the full force of his terror to keep it from debilitating his own men along with the enemy. When his men had pulled out of the way, he lowered his hood. The 6 standing warriors beheld him, black hair and black eyes and a deadly pale face with a long, hooked nose. He fixed his stare on them, and when he did this, Chad and Keel immediately fell backward and crumpled on the ground in terror. They hid their heads in their hands and whimpered in fear. Alva, Prior, Pensor, and Bonson were shaking convulsively. It was all they could do to stand, but they were still standing, to the shock of what was left of the enemy soldiers. The Dark Warrior's power had caused entire armies to be routed by his troops as they fled in terror, yet these 4 warriors stood. This filled the Dark Warrior with rage. The power of fear had been all he had needed to defeat enemies for many season changes. He fixed the full power of his gaze on them one by one to crush their final resistance. First, he fixed it on Prior because he was the largest and strongest of the group. Prior trembled violently for a moment, then he finally hurled himself backward, his giant form face down on the ground with his hands above his head, screaming. Next, he fixed his gaze on Bonson, who was now the largest man standing. This day's battle had been important for Bonson. Though he knew he lost hope to Alva, he could still show her and all the others that he was every bit the warrior Alva was. He had determined to face this warrior till the end. He stood as long as he could under the dark gaze, but before long he too melted to the ground, sobbing and wailing in terror and shame. Pincer was shorter than Alva, but he was a man of much greater mass with his broad, muscular figure. The dark gaze was fixed on him, and he too fell to the ground. Now only Alva was standing. The dark gaze fixed on him with all its power of fear. He trembled so violently that he dropped his shield and sword, but he still stood. The dark warrior had gradually moved forward as he fixed his gaze on the man. Now he was within 20 paces of Alva. With nothing to lose, Alva wanted to lunge at him, but he could not move. He could barely stand, but stand he did. He looked directly into the black eyes and spoke in a cracked voice. "I am Lord Alva Denay, the only living son and heir of Al-Salah Denay the 26th, and I promise you that you are not going to touch that girl." The dark warrior smiled maliciously. Yes, this man had stood. He had borne the full brunt of terror, but as Alva suspected, terror was not the extent of his power. Suddenly his black eyes filled with rage, and his stare became even more intense than before. As he took another step forward, Alva felt his eyes and throat began to burn as though there was smoke. He could not see, and he began to cough violently, but still he stood. His love for Hope gave him strength. Surely this was buying her some more time. The moment he fell, the dark warrior would pursue her with his men and leave Alva and his companions to bleed to death from their many wounds. The man took another step forward, and the cold Alva had felt for many hours became intense and painful. It was a burning cold like the pain one feels immediately when sticking his hand into a bucket of ice-cold water. The pain from this cold, however, never subsided into numbness. Alva felt its burning pain on every inch of his skin. He could no longer see, and he could barely breathe. Still he stood, but he knew it would not be for long. He knew this was the end. His strength was gone. He was running on sheer will, but will could not carry a man forever. He felt all begin to go dark, and his legs began to give way. He stumbled, but a sudden burst of strength allowed his trained reflexes to catch his feet. Something new was happening. Suddenly, Alva felt a great warmth on his back. He began to breathe more freely and recover his sight. He saw that, though the last dusk of the day was fading, there was a radiant light like the sun shining from behind him. It was a bright, powerful light. The light was pouring through the opening in the lake wall. Seeing again, Alva saw that the dark warrior now stood within 10 paces of him. His eyes had been fixed on him, but with this new challenge, he took his dark and powerful gaze off of Alva and fixed it behind him, apparently on the source of the light. The removal of the man's stare gave Alva a new feeling of freedom and strength. He did not hesitate for an instant. With the dark warrior so distracted, he ran forward, drawing his long dagger from his belt, point down in his right hand, and plunged it directly into the dark heart. Alva felt a freezing pain shooting up his right arm. This action took the last of his strength, and he knew that this was the end. His mind pictured Hope one last time, and then everything went dark. When Hope suddenly realized the certainty of Alva's death and that of the other warriors, she remembered the nightmare she'd had the night before their journey began. It had not been about her parents. The forest they were running in and through was the same as in her dream. The children she had seen were the children she had begun to see when Alva said he loved her. The great sense of loss was the death of Alva and the other warriors. Eventually, the Dark Company would finish them off and be back on their trail. Eventually, they would catch up. Hela would put her down, tell her to run while he and Nira tried to hold them. I should have gone back, she remembered herself saying. When? She thought. Now! Hope's glow suddenly turned into a blinding radiance. Hela, who was running with her in his arms, nearly dropped her. As it was, he and Nira came to a halt. Hope wriggled to the ground. Alva! She shouted, then she turned and ran back up the ravine trail which they had been coming down. Hope! Stop! Both Nira and Hela called after her, but she did not hear them. All she could think of were Alva and the other warriors, all of whom she had grown to love so. She thought of them dying in the dry lake bed. She ran back with all her might. What she would do when she got there she did not know, but she felt she must be with them. They must not die. Alva must not die. She had to go back. Hela and Nira ran after her, calling her to come back, but because they were weary and she had received some new strength, they could not catch her. Why did she not see that she was throwing away everything they had all fought for? How could Hope be so foolish? When Hope finally became aware of her calls, she did not stop or answer. It was the first time in her life that she had defied either Hela or Nira, but they just wouldn't understand. She had to go back. She ran on as the enemy army approached her warriors. She ran on as the battle raged. She approached the foot of the hillside leading down from the lake, just as the Dark Warrior said, Enough! Not stopping for breath, she immediately began scampering up the ravine. She did not realize it, but as she ran, her countenance was becoming brighter and brighter. She shone like the morning sun. When she reached the doorway, she saw the warriors scattered around her on the ground. Those who were still conscious had been cringing in terror, but this began to subside as her light shone on them. She saw Alva standing before the Dark Warrior. The Dark Warrior fixed his evil black eyes on her, and she stared back in defiance. He had no power over her. She had no time to think about what to do next, because almost as soon as this man's eyes were off of Alva, Alva's dagger was in his heart. Alva had fallen sideways and rolled over face up. Hope ran to him and saw that he lay with multiple wounds, his face was snow white, and he was not breathing. No! Hope screamed out. She had made it too late. She leapt on Alva and threw her arms around his lifeless body, sobbing and screaming, No! And Alva! Alternately. Bye.